What happens when a trusted teacher becomes the source of a young boy's greatest pain? Ethan Walker, an enthusiastic 8-year-old, loved school until a cruel comment from his teacher shattered his confidence. Struggling to make sense of the hurt, Ethan spirals into self-doubt, but his family refuses to let the injustice go unanswered. This gripping story follows Ethan's emotional journey as he and his family fight back, seeking justice and healing. Will he reclaim his confidence and turn his pain into a force for good? Like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. What would you do if faced with a challenge like Ethan's? Let us know in the comments. The morning sun filtered into Ethan Walker's bedroom, casting a warm golden hue over the comic book posters on the walls and the scattered action figures on his desk. At 8 years old, Ethan was full of energy, waking up each day with boundless enthusiasm. He tossed aside his Star Wars-themed blanket and hopped out of bed, a grin on his face as he remembered the previous night. He had stayed up just a bit later than usual, meticulously finishing his math homework. Today, he was sure his teacher, Mrs. Harris, would be impressed. Ethan quickly dressed himself, pulling on his favorite blue hoodie, and rushed downstairs. The smell of breakfast greeted him, and he found his mom, Lisa, standing by the stove, humming as she flipped pancakes. "Morning, Mom," Ethan said, his voice filled with excitement. Lisa turned with a bright smile, her eyes twinkling. "Good morning, sweetheart. You're up early. Did you sleep well?" "Yeah, I did. I can't wait to show Mrs. Harris did my homework today. I worked really hard on it." Lisa poured a glass of orange juice and set it in front of Ethan. "I'm sure she'll be impressed, honey. You always do a great job." Ethan beamed as he dug into his pancakes, his mind buzzing with thoughts of school. He loved math. Numbers always made sense to him. He was one of the top students in his class, and he was proud of it. He knew his parents were proud too, especially his dad, Mark, who was a civil rights attorney. Mark was often busy with work, but whenever he had time, he helped Ethan with his schoolwork, reminding him that hard work and dedication were key to achieving anything in life. As Ethan ate, Mark walked into the kitchen, straightening his tie. He glanced at Ethan with a smile, ruffling his son's curly hair. "You ready for school, champ?" "Yep. I think Mrs. Harris is going to be really happy with my homework." Mark poured himself a cup of coffee, his smile growing wider. "That's great, buddy. You're going to do awesome today. Just keep putting in that effort, and nothing can stop you." After breakfast, Ethan grabbed his backpack and headed toward the door. Lisa kissed him on the forehead. "Have a great day, sweetheart. I'll pick you up after school." "Okay, Mom. Love you." "Love you too," Lisa called after him as he bounced out the door. The cool autumn air nipped at his cheeks as he made his way to Maple Ridge Elementary, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders with each eager step. The trees lining the streets were a mix of vibrant reds and oranges, their leaves slowly falling as the season deepened. Ethan felt a burst of excitement as he thought about the day ahead. He couldn't wait to see his friends and tackle whatever challenges came his way. As he reached the front steps of the school, he spotted his best friend, Connor, waiting by the entrance. Connor was a bit taller than Ethan, with wild blonde hair and a constant mischievous glint in his eyes. He waved as Ethan approached. "Hey, Ethan. Ready for another day of Mrs. Harris's fun-filled math class?" Connor asked with a smirk. Ethan grinned. "You know it. I worked extra hard on the homework last night. I'm sure Mrs. Harris is going to like it." Connor raised an eyebrow. "I don't know, man. She's pretty tough. My homework's kind of a mess. I didn't have time to finish it." "You'll be fine," Ethan said, ever the optimist. "Mrs. Harris just wants us to try our best." The bell rang, signaling the start of the school day, and the two boys hurried inside, joining the crowd of students making their way to their classrooms. Ethan's third-grade class was small, with about 20 students. but it felt like a little community. Everyone knew each other, and while Mrs. Harris was strict, Ethan had always admired her. She was experienced, and when she gave praise, it felt earned. When Ethan walked into the classroom, Mrs. Harris was already seated at her desk, her sharp eyes scanning over papers in front of her. She was a tall, thin woman with graying hair tied up in a neat bun, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and she rarely smiled, at least not in the warm way Ethan's parents did. But Ethan didn't mind. He was determined to impress her. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," Ethan called out, flashing her a wide grin as he took his seat. Mrs. Harris glanced up briefly, her lips barely moving as she muttered, "Good morning, Ethan. Please take your seat. Let's get started." Ethan's smile faltered slightly, but he shrugged it off. He knew Mrs. Harris wasn't one for pleasantries. Still, he had high hopes for the day. He pulled out his math homework and placed it neatly on the corner of his desk, just as Mrs. Harris had instructed. His chest swelled with pride, knowing he had given it his all. As the morning went on, Mrs. Harris began her usual math lesson, walking to the front of the class with a no-nonsense air. "Who can tell me what 8 times 7 is?" she asked, scanning the room. Ethan's hand shot up immediately. He stretched his arm as high as it could go, his fingers wiggling eagerly. He loved multiplication, and he knew the answer right away. 56, he thought to himself, waiting for Mrs. Harris to call on him, but Mrs. Harris's eyes skimmed past him as if he wasn't there. "Emily," she said, pointing to a blonde girl sitting in the front row. 56, Emily answered confidently. "Very good, Emily," Mrs. Harris praised, smiling warmly at the girl. Ethan's arm slowly lowered, a frown creasing his forehead. He had known the answer too, and he was the first to raise his hand. It wasn't the first time this had happened. Lately, Mrs. Harris seemed to ignore him in class, even when he was excited to participate. He glanced around at his classmates. Tyler, another boy in his class, was often called on, and Mrs. Harris seemed to favor him. Tyler was smart too, but Ethan didn't understand why his teacher rarely gave him the same recognition. As the lesson went on, Ethan pushed the thought aside, determined to focus. He knew he was good at math. Maybe Mrs. Harris was just saving his moment to shine for later. By mid-morning, Ethan's excitement to show off his homework hadn't faded. He had been so careful, making sure his answers were clear and his handwriting neat. When Mrs. Harris began walking around the room to collect the homework, Ethan felt a surge of anticipation. As Mrs. Harris reached his desk, she took his paper without a word and continued down the row. Ethan felt his heart flutter with nerves, hoping she would look at his work and see how much effort he had put into it. Later, during independent work time, Mrs. Harris began handing back the graded homework assignments. Ethan's heart raced with excitement, and he could hardly sit still as she made her way toward him. He was sure she'd be proud of what he'd done. But when Mrs. Harris placed his paper on his desk, her face didn't show any sign of approval. She didn't even glance at him. Ethan flipped the page over, eager to see the grade, and then his stomach dropped. Written in large red letters at the top of the page were the words, "Messy and lazy, typical for someone like you." For a moment, Ethan stared at the paper, unable to process what he was seeing. He blinked several times, reading the comment over and over again, hoping it would somehow change. Messy and lazy, typical for someone like you. What did that even mean? Ethan had tried so hard to make his handwriting neat. He had double-checked every answer. How could this be? And why would Mrs. Harris wrote something so mean? His hands trembled as he held the paper, his vision blurring slightly with unshed tears. He quickly wiped his eyes, glancing around the classroom to see if anyone had noticed. But his classmates were focused on their own work, seemingly unaware of the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Ethan wanted to ask Mrs. Harris what she meant by her comment, but he couldn't find the words. His throat felt tight, and his heart pounded in his chest. He had never felt so confused, so hurt. He had always done well in school. He was the kind of kid who cared about his grades, who wanted to make his parents proud. But now, it felt like all of that had been shattered by a few careless words scrawled in red ink. For the rest of the day, Ethan couldn't focus. Mrs. Harris continued teaching, her voice droning on in the background, but Ethan's mind was somewhere else. He kept staring at the comment, the words swirling in his head. Typical for someone like you. What did that mean? Was she saying he wasn't smart? Was there something wrong with him? Ethan's chest tightened at the thought. He didn't want to believe it, but the words were right there in front of him. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Ethan felt numb. He packed his things slowly, tucking the paper deep into his backpack, not wanting anyone to see it. As he walked out of the classroom, his usual bounce was gone. The weight of Mrs. Harris's words hung over him like a dark cloud. When he reached the school parking lot, he saw his mom, Lisa, waiting for him near their car. She waved when she saw him, her smile bright and warm as always. "Hey, sweetie, how was school today?" Ethan forced a small smile. "It was fine," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Lisa's smile faltered slightly. "Are you sure? You seem a little quiet." "I'm fine, Mom," Ethan insisted, climbing into the back seat. Lisa glanced at him in the rearview mirror as they drove home, her motherly instincts telling her something was off. But she didn't push. Instead, she decided to wait until he was ready to talk. Ethan had always been a bright, happy child, and she didn't want to overwhelm him with questions. Back at home, Ethan quietly retreated to his room, dropping his backpack on the floor by his bed. He sat down at his desk, pulling out his math homework and staring at the red letters again. Messy and lazy, typical for someone like you. The words burned into his mind, and for the first time, he felt doubt creep into his thoughts. Maybe Mrs. Harris was right. Maybe he wasn't as smart as he thought. Maybe no matter how hard he tried, it would never be enough. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He didn't want to cry. He didn't want to feel weak. Instead, he shoved the paper into his desk drawer, hiding it from view. Maybe if he didn't look at it, it would stop hurting so much. Over the next few days, Ethan did his best to push the memory of Mrs. Harris's hurtful comment out of his mind. He told himself it didn't matter, that he just needed to try harder, be better. But no matter how much he told himself those things, the sting of those words lingered. At school, Ethan became quieter. He didn't raise his hand as often, even when he knew the answer. He kept his head down, focusing on his work, but never volunteering to participate. He didn't want to give Mrs. Harris another reason to criticize him. His friends noticed the change. At recess, Ethan no longer joined the soccer games with Connor and the others. Instead, he sat on the sidelines, watching the game but not really paying attention. "Hey, Ethan, you want to play?" Connor asked one afternoon, jogging over to where Ethan sat. Ethan shook his head. "Nah, I'm okay." Connor frowned, sitting down beside him. "You've been acting kind of weird lately. What's going on?" "Nothing," Ethan mumbled, picking at a blade of grass. "I'm just tired." Connor didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "Well, if you change your mind, we're gonna need another player." "Okay," Ethan said, but he didn't move. At home, things weren't much better. Lisa and Mark both noticed that their usually talkative, energetic son had become withdrawn. He spent more time alone in his room, claiming he had homework to do, but when they peeked in on him, they often found him sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his papers. One evening, as Ethan sat at the dinner table, pushing his food around his plate, Mark decided to ask him about school. "How's everything going at school, buddy?" Mark asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Ethan shrugged. "It's fine. Just fine." Mark pressed gently. "You usually have a lot more to say about your day." Ethan didn't look up from his plate. "I don't know. I guess school's just hard right now." Lisa and Mark exchanged a concerned glance. They knew something was wrong, but Ethan wasn't opening up. "Do you want to talk about it?" Lisa asked softly. Ethan shook his head. "I'm fine. I just have a lot of homework." Mark sighed, sensing that pushing him wouldn't help. "Okay, but if there's anything bothering you, you know you can talk to us, right? We're here for you." Ethan nodded, but he still didn't look up. He just wanted to disappear. He didn't want to disappoint his parents by telling them that his teacher thought he was lazy and messy. He didn't want them to see him as a failure. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had always been proud of his schoolwork. He had always loved learning, loved the feeling of getting the right answer and hearing his teachers praise him. But now, everything felt different. School didn't feel like a place where he belonged anymore. It felt like a place where he was constantly being judged, constantly being told he wasn't good enough. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Harris was right. Several weeks passed, and the weight of Mrs. Harris's comment continued to hang over Ethan. His grades started slipping. His once enthusiastic participation in class dwindled, and his teachers, aside from Mrs. Harris, began to notice the change. He had gone from being one of the brightest students in the class to someone who barely raised his hand, who sat silently during lessons, his eyes downcast. At home, Ethan became more withdrawn. Lisa and Mark tried to coax him out of his shell, offering help with homework, asking him to join family game nights. But Ethan always had an excuse. "I'm tired. I have too much homework. I don't feel like it." Lisa's worry for her son grew each day. She could sense that something was wrong, but Ethan wasn't talking to her or Mark. One afternoon, as she was tidying up Ethan's room, she noticed a corner of paper sticking out from under his bed. Curiosity piqued. She knelt down and pulled the paper out, realizing it was one of Ethan's math homework assignments. When she unfolded the paper and saw the red letters scrawled across the top, her heart sank. "Messy and lazy. Typical for someone like you." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and anger. How could a teacher write something like this? How could she be so cruel to a child? Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes as she stared at the comment. Her sweet, hard-working son had been carrying this around for weeks, hiding it from her and Mark. No wonder he had been so withdrawn. No wonder his confidence had been shattered. Just then, she heard a soft gasp from the doorway. Lisa turned to see Ethan standing there, his eyes wide with fear as he realized his secret had been discovered. "Ethan." Lisa's voice was barely a whisper, filled with heartbreak. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Ethan's face crumpled and he looked down at his feet. "I didn't want you to be mad," he mumbled, his voice trembling. Lisa crossed the room in an instant, kneeling in front of her son and pulling him into a tight embrace. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not mad. I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this all by yourself." Ethan's small body shook with silent sobs as he buried his face in his mother's shoulder. Lisa held him close, her own tears falling freely. She couldn't believe her son had been enduring this kind of hurt for so long, too afraid to tell anyone. When Ethan finally pulled back, Lisa wiped his tears and cupped his face in her hands. "Listen to me, Ethan. What Mrs. Harris wrote is wrong. There is nothing lazy or messy about you. You are smart and kind, and you work so hard. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're less than that." Ethan sniffled, his eyes red and swollen. "But she's my teacher. She's supposed to know if I'm doing something wrong." Lisa's heart broke at the vulnerability in her son's voice. Teachers are supposed to help us learn, not tear us down. And what did she do? That's not okay. When Mark came home that evening, Lisa showed him the paper. His face darkened with anger as he read the comment, his jaw clenching. How could a teacher write this to a child? He muttered, barely able to contain his frustration. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap as he waited for his dad's reaction. Mark knelt in front of his son, his voice gentle but firm. Ethan, listen to me. What Mrs. Harris wrote, that it has nothing to do with you or your abilities. You are smart, you are capable, and you have nothing to be ashamed of. We're going to handle this, okay? Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear. He had been carrying the burden of Mrs. Harris's words for so long, but now that his parents knew, he didn't feel quite so alone. Mark stood up, his expression determined. I'm going to set up a meeting with the school. This isn't going to happen again. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he felt a strange sense of hope. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe things could change. The next morning, a nervous energy filled the Walker household. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, nibbling on a piece of toast, but his usual appetite was nowhere to be found. His stomach churned with anxiety as he thought about the upcoming meeting at school. His parents were going to talk to Principal O'Connell about Mrs. Harris, and the idea of confronting his teacher terrified him. Are you sure I have to be there? Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Mark, standing near the kitchen counter with his phone in hand, glanced over at him and gave a reassuring smile. You don't have to say anything, buddy. Your mom and I will handle everything. But it's important that you're there so they know how serious this is. Ethan nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't ease. Lisa sat down beside him, rubbing his back gently. It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We're just going to make sure they know what's been happening. You didn't do anything wrong. Even with his parents' reassurances, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. What if Mrs. Harris was angry after the meeting? What if she treated him worse? The thought of facing her again made his heart race. By the time they arrived at Maple Ridge Elementary, Ethan felt as though he was walking through a fog. The school that had once felt like a safe place now seemed intimidating. His feet dragged as they walked through the familiar hallways toward the principal's office, where Principal O'Connell and Mrs. Harris was waiting. As they entered the small conference room, Ethan's pulse quickened. Principal O'Connell sat at the head of the table, his expression calm but serious. Mrs. Harris sat to the side, her sharp eyes scanning over the paperwork in front of her. She didn't look at Ethan, and the coldness in her demeanor only made him feel smaller. Mr. and Mrs. Walker, Principal O'Connell began, standing to shake their hands. Thank you for coming in today. Mark nodded, his face set in a determined expression. Thank you for meeting with us. We have some concerns about Mrs. Harris's treatment of our son, Ethan. Principal O'Connell gestured for them to sit, and the Walkers took their seats, with Ethan sitting between his parents. He kept his eyes on his lap, not daring to look up at Mrs. Harris, who remained silent. Mark wasted no time, pulling out the copy of Ethan's homework that Lisa had found. He slid it across the table to Principal O'Connell, the red letters glaring up from the page. This is what Mrs. Harris wrote on one of Ethan's assignments. Principal O'Connell picked up the paper and read the comment, his brows furrowing slightly. He glanced over at Mrs. Harris, then back at Mark. I see. Mrs. Harris, would you care to explain this? Mrs. Harris glanced at the paper, her expression unchanged. I was simply providing feedback on Ethan's work. His handwriting was messy, and I was encouraging him to put in more effort. Mark's jaw tightened. Encouragement? You wrote typical for someone like you. That's not encouragement. That's a targeted, discriminatory comment. Mrs. Harris's eyes flickered with a hint of annoyance, but her voice remained steady. You're reading too much into it. I meant that Ethan's work has been consistently below par. There was no malice intended. Lisa, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward, her voice firm but measured. Mrs. Harris, our son has always been a dedicated student. He's one of the top performers in his class, and he works hard on his assignments. Your comment crushed his confidence. He's been withdrawing from class and from us because of the way you've treated him. Principal O'Connell cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. Mrs. Harris, I think it's important to recognize how your words may have been perceived, even if that wasn't your intent. Ethan's parents are understandably concerned about the impact this has had on him. Mrs. Harris's gaze shifted to Principal O'Connell, and for a moment, a flicker of frustration crossed her face. I'm sorry if my comment was misinterpreted, but I stand by the fact that Ethan's work has not met my standards. Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped that Mrs. Harris would admit she was wrong, that she would apologize. But instead, she was doubling down, insisting that he wasn't good enough. Mark's voice grew firmer, though he kept his composure. It's not about whether his work meets your standards. It's about the fact that you've been singling him out and writing hurtful comments that have affected his mental health and his performance in school. Principal O'Connell sighed, folding his hands on the table. This is obviously a serious issue, and I understand why you're upset. I'll need to review this more thoroughly, and I'd like to have a follow-up meeting to discuss next steps. In the meantime, Mrs. Harris, I would ask that you be more mindful of how you phrase your feedback, especially when dealing with young students. Mrs. Harris nodded stiffly. Of course, Principal O'Connell. The meeting ended without any real resolution, leaving Ethan feeling even more anxious than before. As they walked out of the school, his parents' expressions were tight with frustration. This isn't over, Mark said, his voice low as they reached the parking lot. We'll make sure they take this seriously. Ethan didn't say anything. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, confusion, and a growing sense of hopelessness. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, things would change. But now he wasn't so sure. The days following the meeting were some of the hardest Ethan had ever experienced. Mrs. Harris returned to the classroom the next day with the same cold, distant attitude, as if the meeting had never happened. She didn't make any more explicit comments on his work, but her disapproval was clear in the way she treated him. Ethan felt invisible. When he raised his hand in class, Mrs. Harris would look past him as if he didn't exist. When she did call on him, it was only to point out his mistakes or suggest that he wasn't working hard enough. The spark of excitement Ethan had once felt for learning was gone, replaced by a constant sense of dread. He stopped raising his hand altogether. He stopped trying to impress Mrs. Harris, realizing that no matter what he did, it would never be good enough. His grades began to slip. Homework that he would have once completed with enthusiasm now felt like a burden. He couldn't focus, couldn't muster the energy to care. At recess, he sat alone, watching the other kids play basketball or soccer. Connor tried to get him to join in, but Ethan always declined, saying he wasn't feeling well or that he had too much on his mind. In truth, he just didn't have the energy to pretend everything was okay. One day, as Ethan sat on a bench by the playground, his thoughts swirling with self-doubt, Connor came over and sat down beside him. "Hey," Connor said, nudging Ethan's shoulder, "you've been acting weird lately. What's going on?" Ethan shrugged, his eyes downcast. "Nothing." "Come on, man, you can tell me," Connor pressed. "You haven't been yourself for weeks." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain what he was feeling. How could he tell Connor that he felt like a failure, that every day in Mrs. Harris's class was a reminder that he wasn't good enough? "I don't know," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess school's just been hard." Connor frowned, concern etched across his face. "Is it Mrs. Harris? She's been kind of rough on you." Ethan nodded slowly, his chest tightening as he thought about the way Mrs. Harris dismissed him time and time again. "Yeah, she doesn't like me." "She's strict with everyone," Connor said, trying to offer some reassurance. "But I don't think she hates you." Ethan didn't respond. Connor didn't know the half of it. He didn't know about the hurtful comments, the way Mrs. Harris made him feel like he didn't belong in the classroom. And Ethan didn't want to explain. It was too embarrassing, too painful. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's isolation grew. He withdrew from his friends, his schoolwork, and even his family. His once bright, enthusiastic demeanor faded into silence. At home, Lisa and Mark grew increasingly worried. "Ethan's been so quiet," Lisa said one evening as she and Mark sat in the living room after Ethan had gone to bed. "He barely talks to us anymore." Mark nodded, his brow furrowed in concern. "I know, I've noticed it too. He's not the same kid he was a few months ago." "It's Mrs. Harris," Lisa said softly. "Ever since that comment, he's been different. She's crushed his confidence." Mark clenched his jaw, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I can't believe a teacher could do this to a kid. We need to do something, Lisa. We need to get the school to take action." Lisa nodded, her heart heavy with worry. "We will. But we need to find a way to help Ethan too. He's hurting and I don't know how to reach him." The weight of their son's struggle hung over them like a dark cloud. They had tried to protect him, to reassure him, but it wasn't enough. Mrs. Harris's words had cut deep, leaving scars that couldn't be healed with simple encouragement. At school, things only got worse. During one particularly difficult math lesson, Mrs. Harris asked for volunteers to solve a complex problem on the board. Ethan's hand remained firmly on his desk, too afraid to participate. He knew the answer, but the fear of being criticized, of being told he was wrong or lazy, kept him silent. Instead, Mrs. Harris called on Tyler, who confidently walked to the board and wrote out the solution. When he was done, Mrs. Harris praised him with a smile. "Excellent work, Tyler," she said. "You've really improved." Ethan's stomach churned with a mixture of jealousy and self-doubt. He used to be the one who earned praise in class. He used to be confident, sure of his abilities. But now he felt like he was sinking, like he would never be able to climb out of the hole Mrs. Harris had pushed him into it. At home, his grades continued to slip. He brought home a report card filled with C's and D's, a far cry from the A's and B's he had always earned. Each poor grade felt like a confirmation of Mrs. Harris's words, proof that he really was lazy and incapable. Lisa and Mark tried to help him, but nothing seemed to work. They sat with him at the kitchen table, going over his homework, offering guidance and support. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was a failure. Even when he got the answers right, it didn't feel like enough. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Mark sat in his office, staring at the stack of legal documents on his desk. He was a civil rights attorney, someone who fought for justice, for fairness, for equality. And yet here he was, unable to protect his own son from the cruelty of a teacher. He picked up his phone and dialed the school district office. It was time to take this to the next level. The next week brought an unexpected change. Mrs. Harris had fallen ill and would be out of the classroom for a few days. In her place, the school assigned a substitute teacher, Mr. Parker. When Ethan walked into the classroom that Monday morning, he was greeted by a friendly tall man with a welcoming smile. Mr. Parker's presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. The usual tension that accompanied Mrs. Harris's stern, intimidating demeanor was replaced with a sense of calm and ease. "Good morning, class," Mr. Parker said brightly. I know change can be a little tough, but I promise we're going to have a great time learning together." The students exchanged curious glances, unsure of what to make of the new teacher, but there was something about Mr. Parker's relaxed energy that put them at ease. Throughout the morning, Mr. Parker's teaching style proved to be a stark contrast to Mrs. Harris's. Where Mrs. Harris had been rigid and unyielding, Mr. Parker was patient and kind. He encouraged the students to ask questions, to take risks, and to not be afraid of making mistakes. When it came time for math, Ethan sat at his desk, his head down. He was used to being overlooked, to feeling like his answers didn't matter. But Mr. Parker had other plans. "Ethan, why don't you come up to the board and help us solve this one?" Mr. Parker said with a warm smile. Ethan's heart raced. His first instinct was to shake his head, to refuse. But there was something different about the way Mr. Parker asked. There was no pressure, no expectation that he would fail. Slowly, Ethan stood up and walked to the board. He worked through the problem carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he wrote out the solution. When he finished, he turned to face Mr. Parker, bracing himself for criticism. But instead, Mr. Parker's smile widened. "Great job, Ethan. You nailed it." Ethan blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected praise. He hadn't expected anyone to believe in him. A small, hesitant smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he walked back to his seat. For the rest of the week, Mr. Parker continued to call on Ethan, giving him opportunities to participate, to rebuild the confidence that Mrs. Harris was torn down. With each small success, Ethan felt a flicker of hope reignite inside him. By Friday, he was raising his hand again, eager to contribute to class discussions. His friends noticed the change, too. At recess, Connor ran up to him, grinning. "Dude, you've been on fire this week," Connor said. "Mr. Parker's cool, right?" Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Yeah, he's really cool." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he belonged in the classroom again. He felt like his voice mattered. But even as hope blossomed, there was a nagging fear in the back of his mind. Mrs. Harris will be back soon. And when she returned, things would go back to the way they were. Ethan's brief reprieve under Mr. Parker's care came to an abrupt end when Mrs. Harris returned to the classroom the following Monday. The moment she walked through the door, the familiar tension settled back over the room like a dark cloud. The smiles and laughter that had filled the classroom under Mr. Parker's guidance vanished, replaced by the cold, rigid atmosphere Mrs. Harris demanded. Ethan's heart sank. All the confidence he had begun to rebuild crumbled the moment Mrs. Harris resumed her place at the front of the room. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Harris said, her voice sharp and to the point. "I trust you didn't fall behind while I was gone." Ethan kept his head down, hoping she wouldn't call on him. The fear that had once consumed him returned in full force, and the small spark of hope he had felt was snuffed out in an instant. The day dragged on, each lesson punctuated by Mrs. Harris's disapproval. When it came time for math, she asked for volunteers to solve a particularly challenging problem on the board. Ethan hesitated, his hand twitching slightly. He knew the answer, but the fear of being ridiculed kept him silent. "Tyler," Mrs. Harris said, calling on the class favorite. Tyler confidently approached the board, solving the problem with ease. Mrs. Harris smiled approvingly. "Well done, Tyler. You've made excellent progress." Ethan's stomach twisted with jealousy and frustration. He had known the answer, but he hadn't been brave enough to speak up. And now it felt like another missed opportunity, another chance to prove himself that had slipped away. As the day wore on, Ethan grew quieter and more withdrawn. By the time the final bell rang, he felt like a shell of the boy who had started the week with renewed hope. Mrs. Harris had a way of making him feel small, invisible, and powerless. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the shadow she cast over him. That night, as Ethan sat in his room, staring at the homework he had barely touched, he felt the familiar weight of hopelessness settle over him. His parents had done everything they could to help, but nothing seemed to change. Mrs. Harris still saw him as lazy and inadequate, and he was starting to believe it himself. He picked up his math notebook, flipping through the pages filled with numbers and equations. In the past, math had been his favorite subject, but now it felt like a reminder of all the ways he had failed. He could still hear Mrs. Harris's voice in his head, telling him his work was sloppy, telling him he wasn't good enough. Tears prickled at the corners of his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, refusing to let himself cry. He didn't want to feel weak, didn't want to let Mrs. Harris's words break him, but the truth was, they already had. The next day, Ethan's dread of school was stronger than ever. He walked into the classroom with his head down, avoiding Mrs. Harris's gaze. His stomach twisted with anxiety as he took his seat, and the familiar sense of dread settled over him. By mid-morning, it was clear that Mrs. Harris hadn't forgotten about the meeting with Ethan's parents. Her cold, distant treatment of him had turned into something more insidious. Whenever she glanced in his direction, there was a sharpness in her eyes that made Ethan feel like she was waiting for him to fail. During math, she called on him to solve a difficult problem on the board. Ethan's heart raced as he stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He knew the answer, he was sure of it, but his fear of making a mistake made his hands tremble as he wrote the numbers on the board. When he finished, he turned to Mrs. Harris, hoping for some sign of approval, some indication that he had done well. But Mrs. Harris's lips thinned into a tight line. "That's one way to do it," she said coolly, "but it's not the most efficient method. Tyler, would you like to show us a better way?" Ethan's cheeks burned with embarrassment as he returned to his seat, feeling the weight of his classmates' eyes on him. He had solved the problem correctly, but it wasn't good enough for Mrs. Harris. Nothing he did was ever good enough. The rest of the day passed in a blur of humiliation and self-doubt. By the time school ended, Ethan was ready to crawl into bed and hide from the world. He didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to face his parents' worried questions. When he got home, he went straight to his room, throwing his backpack onto the floor and collapsing onto his bed. He buried his face in his pillow, the tears he had been holding back finally spilling over. For the first time in weeks, he let himself cry. He cried all the time Mrs. Harris had made him feel small, for the confidence she had stolen from him, for the way he had started to believe her hurtful words. He cried for the boy he used to be, the boy who had loved school, who had loved learning, who had once believed in himself. And as he cried, a thought crept into his mind, one that had been growing quietly in the back of his mind for weeks. Maybe Mrs. Harris was right. Maybe he wasn't smart enough. Maybe he wasn't good enough. Ethan sat in his room, the quiet darkness surrounding him like a heavy blanket. The emotional exhaustion that had consumed him for weeks had finally reached a tipping point. His mind raced with doubts. The hurtful words of Mrs. Harris is playing on a loop in his head. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't silence the voice telling him that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't belong. The once safe space of school had turned into a place of dread. The classroom, where he had once thrived, felt like a battlefield now, a place where every mistake felt magnified, every failure felt final. His love for math, his enthusiasm for learning, had been crushed under the weight of Mrs. Harris's judgment. It was late, long after his parents had gone to bed, but Ethan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his thoughts restless and anxious. The dim light from the hallway cast shadows across his room, and for the first time in his young life, he felt completely alone. He had tried to push through the hurt, to ignore Mrs. Harris's cutting remarks, but it was becoming too much to bear. His grades were slipping, His friends were starting to drift away, and even his parents, despite their love and support, couldn't fully understand the depth of the pain he was carrying. He felt like a failure. He felt like nothing he did mattered. Suddenly, the weight of everything, the months of silent suffering, the endless self-doubt overwhelmed him. Tears that he had been holding back for so long finally broke free, and he sobbed quietly into his pillow, his small body shaking with the force of his emotions. He had never felt so helpless, so lost. As the tears streamed down his face, he thought back to the boy he used to be. The boy who had woken up every morning excited to go to school. The boy who had loved answering questions in class, who had proudly brought home report cards filled with A's. Where had that boy gone? And would he ever come back? In that moment, curled up on his bed, Ethan realized he couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. He didn't know what, but he couldn't stay trapped in this cycle of fear and doubt any longer. He needed help, even if he was too afraid to ask for it. The next morning, Ethan felt drained. His eyes were swollen from crying, and he moved through the house in a fog. When he arrived at the breakfast table, his parents immediately noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the slumped posture that had become all too familiar. Lisa placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, concern etched across her face. "Ethan, honey, are you feeling okay? You look exhausted." Ethan shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "I didn't sleep much." Mark set down his coffee, studying his son closely. "Is it about school? Is Mrs. Harris still giving you a hard time?" For a moment, Ethan considered brushing off their questions, like he had so many times before. But something inside him snapped. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. He couldn't keep hiding how much he was struggling. I don't know," Ethan said, his voice trembling. I don't want to go to school anymore." Lisa and Mark exchanged a worried glance. They had known things were bad, but this was the first time Ethan had openly admitted how deeply he was hurting. "Ethan," Lisa said gently, kneeling down beside him, "we've been trying to help you, but we need to know what's really going on. We can't fix this unless you talk to us." Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. "I just feel like I'm not good enough. No matter what I do, it's never enough for Mrs. Harris. She makes me feel like I'm lazy and stupid, and I'm tired of it." Mark's expression darkened, anger simmering just below the surface. "You are not lazy, and you are definitely not stupid. Mrs. Harris has no right to make you feel that way." Ethan nodded, but doubt still lingered. "But what if she's right? What if I'm just not smart enough?" Lisa's heart ached at the vulnerability in her son's voice. She pulled him into a tight hug, her own eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, sweetheart, you are smart, you are kind, and you work so hard. What Mrs. Harris said is wrong. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Mark placed a comforting hand on Ethan's back, his voice firm. "We're going to fix this, Ethan. I'm not letting Mrs. Harris treat you this way anymore." Ethan wiped his eyes, sniffling. "But what if she gets mad? What if things get worse?" "They won't," Mark said, his voice resolute. "We're going to take this to the school board if we have to. Mrs. Harris can't get away with this." Lisa nodded in agreement. "And in the meantime, we're going to help you get through this. We'll talk to the school about getting you some extra support, okay? You're not alone in this, Ethan." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a small glimmer of hope. His parents were in his corner, fighting for him, and maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Mark wasted no time. After their conversation with Ethan, he called the school district office and requested a meeting with the school board president, Mr. Donovan. Mark's background as a civil rights attorney had given him a deep understanding of the systemic issues that often plagued schools, and he knew that Mrs. Harris's behavior needed to be addressed on a larger scale. A few days later, Mark and Lisa found themselves sitting in the school district's administrative office waiting to meet with Mr. Donovan and Principal O'Connell. The tension in the air was palpable. Both parents were determined to get justice for Ethan, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. When Mr. Donovan entered the room, his expression was polite but guarded. He had dealt with concerned parents before, but the seriousness of the Walkers' complaint had caught his attention. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker," Mr. Donovan said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming in. I understand you have some concerns regarding Mrs. Harris." Mark nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "We do. Our son, Ethan, has been dealing with what we believe is discrimination and emotional mistreatment by Mrs. Harris. It's not just about one comment. This has been an ongoing issue that has severely impacted his mental health and academic performance." Lisa pulled out the homework assignment where Mrs. Harris had written the cruel comment and placed it on the table in front of Mr. Donovan. "This is just one example of the way she's treated our son." Mr. Donovan picked up the paper, his brow furrowing as he read the words scrawled in red ink. "Typical for someone like you," he murmured. "I see." Principal O'Connell, who had been sitting quietly until now, cleared his throat. "I've already spoken with Mrs. Harris about this, and she claims it was a misunderstanding." Mark's voice hardened. "A misunderstanding? This isn't a simple mistake. Mrs. Harris's behavior has caused significant harm to our son. His confidence has been destroyed, and his grades have dropped because of the way she's treated him." Mr. Donovan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Walker, and I take these concerns very seriously. However, before we can take any action, we need to conduct a formal investigation. We'll interview Mrs. Harris as well as Ethan and gather any other relevant information." Lisa frowned. "How long will this take?" "It will take some time," Mr. Donovan admitted. "But I assure you we will handle this as quickly as possible. In the meantime, we'll ensure that Ethan is treated fairly in Mrs. Harris's class." Mark didn't look satisfied, but he knew that pushing too hard could backfire. "We expect this to be taken seriously. If necessary, we're prepared to escalate this to a higher level." Mr. Donovan nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. We'll be in touch once the investigation is underway." As Mark and Lisa left the meeting, their emotions were mixed. On the one hand, they were relieved that the school board was taking their complaint seriously, but on the other hand, they knew that the process could take weeks. Weeks in that Ethan would still have to face Mrs. Harris. "We're not giving up," Mark said as they walked to the car. "We'll keep fighting until this is resolved." Lisa nodded, her heart heavy with worry. "I just hope Ethan can hold on until then." Back at home, Ethan sat quietly at the kitchen table working on his homework. His parents had explained the situation to him, that the school board was investigating Mrs. Harris, and those things will hopefully change soon. But the thought of having to go back to her class every day, knowing that she was still in charge, made his stomach churn. The days dragged on as the investigation progressed. Ethan tried to keep his head down in class, avoiding Mrs. Harris's gaze whenever possible. He still felt the sting of her disapproval, but knowing that his parents were fighting for him gave him a small sense of comfort. At recess, he sat alone on the swings, watching his classmates play basketball. He wanted to join in, to feel normal again, but something inside him held him back. He still didn't feel like he belonged. One afternoon, as Ethan sat on the bench, Connor jogged over, his face flushed from running. "Hey, Ethan," Connor said, sitting down beside him. "You've been pretty quiet lately. You okay?" Ethan shrugged. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." Connor frowned. "Is it about Mrs. Harris?" She's been acting weird since you guys had that meeting with the principal. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, she's still really hard on me, but my parents are trying to get the school to do something about it. Connor gave him a sympathetic look. That sucks, man. I'm sorry you're going through that. For a moment, the two boys sat in silence, watching the other kids play. Then Connor grinned and nudged Ethan's shoulder. Want to come play basketball with us? We need one more player. Ethan hesitated, the familiar anxiety bubbling up inside him. But then he remembered the way Mr. Parker had encouraged him, the way his parents had told him he was capable and smart. Slowly, he nodded. Yeah, I think I'll play. As he jogged over to join the game, something shifted inside Ethan. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking back a small piece of himself, the boy who had loved playing with his friends, who had believed in his abilities. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Weeks passed, and the school board's investigation into Mrs. Harris finally came to a conclusion. Mark and Lisa were called back to the district office for a final meeting with Mr. Donovan and Principal O'Connell. This time, the tone was more serious and the stakes were higher. As they sat down at the conference table, Mr. Donovan handed them a report detailing the findings of the investigation. We've completed our investigation, Mr. Donovan began, his voice steady but grave. After interviewing Mrs. Harris, Ethan, and several other students, it's clear that Mrs. Harris's behavior was inappropriate and damaging to Ethan's well-being. As a result, we've decided to terminate her employment. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She glanced over at Mark, who looked both relieved and satisfied. So she won't be teaching at Maple Ridge anymore? Lisa asked. Mr. Donovan shook his head. Mrs. Harris will no longer be teaching in our district. We've also decided to implement new training programs for all teachers, focusing on preventing discrimination and promoting inclusivity in the classroom. Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Thank you for taking this seriously. This was never just about our son. This was about making sure no other student has to go through what he did. Principal O'Connell, who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up. We deeply regret what happened to Ethan. We should have handled this sooner, and we're committed to making sure this doesn't happen again. Lisa nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. I just want to make sure Ethan feels safe and supported at school. That's all we've ever wanted. As they left the district office, Mark and Lisa exchanged a glance, both of them feeling a mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and a lingering sadness for what Ethan had endured. But they knew this was the right outcome. Justice had been served, and their son could finally begin to heal. At home, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, fidgeting nervously as his parents explained what had happened at the meeting. So, Mrs. Harris is gone? Ethan asked, his voice hesitant. Lisa nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. Yes, sweetheart. She won't be teaching at your school anymore. The school board decided it was the best thing for everyone. Ethan blinked, processing the information. A wave of relief washed over him, but there was also a strange sense of finality. For so long, Mrs. Harris had been a looming presence in his life, and now she is gone. Is it really over? Ethan asked softly, looking up at his parents. Mark smiled gently. Yes, it's over. And you were so brave, Ethan. You helped make this happen. Ethan nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't sure if he believed it yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his chest. Over the next few weeks, things at school slowly began to change. With Mrs. Harris gone, a new teacher, Ms. Ramirez, took over the class. Ms. Ramirez was warm and encouraging, and she immediately made an effort to connect with each student. Ethan noticed the difference right away. Ms. Ramirez didn't just focus on who got the right answers. she celebrated effort and progress, making each student feel valued. For the first time in months, Ethan started to feel like himself again. He raised his hand in class, eager to participate. He began to enjoy school again, and his grades slowly improved as his confidence returned. The dark cloud that had hovered over him since Mrs. Harris's cruel comments began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. At recess, Ethan played basketball with his friends, laughing and running without the weight of fear and self-doubt holding him back. He felt free again, like the boy he had been before. Everything had changed. One afternoon, as Ethan walked home with his dad, he glanced up at Mark, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Dad," Ethan said hesitantly, "do you think I could start something at school, like a club?" Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of club?" Ethan kicked a pebble along the sidewalk, his brow furrowed. "A club where kids can talk about stuff, like when they feel left out or like they don't belong. We could talk about it and help each other." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's a great idea, Ethan. I think your school would love that." As they walked the rest of the way home, Ethan felt a sense of purpose blooming inside him. He wasn't just a kid who had been hurt. He was someone who could make a difference, someone who could help other kids who felt the way he had. And with that realization, Ethan knew that his journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just the beginning. The months following Mrs. Harris's departure marked a significant turning point for Ethan. Ms. Ramirez, his new teacher, was everything Mrs. Harris wasn't: warm, supportive, and genuinely interested in her students' success. The atmosphere in the classroom changed overnight, and Ethan found himself feeling safe and appreciated for the first time in months. Ms. Ramirez quickly recognized Ethan's potential. She encouraged him to participate in class, reminding him that mistakes were a natural part of learning. Every time Ethan raised his hand, every time he worked through a problem, she praised his effort. Slowly but surely, the confidence that Mrs. Harris had torn down and began to rebuild itself. One Friday afternoon, as the bell rang, signaling the end of the school week, Ms. Ramirez called Ethan to her desk. He approached her tentatively, still not fully used to being singled out for praise rather than criticism. "How are you doing, Ethan?" she asked with a kind smile. "I'm doing okay," Ethan said, glancing down at his shoes. "I think I'm getting better at math again." "You're doing great," Ms. Ramirez corrected. "I've noticed how hard you've been working, and I want you to know that I'm really proud of you. You're capable of amazing things, Ethan." Her words sank into him like a warm blanket on a cold day. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a glimmer of pride. "Thanks," he murmured, a shy smile tugging at his lips. As Ethan walked home that afternoon, the weight that had once seemed unbearable was beginning to feel lighter. It wasn't completely gone. He still had moments of doubt, still carried the scars from Mrs. Harris's hurtful words, but he was healing, little by little. That evening after dinner, Ethan decided to bring up something he had been thinking about for a while. His dad was working in his studies, going through some legal documents, when Ethan knocked softly on the door. "Hey, Dad? Can I talk to you for a minute?" Ethan asked, stepping into the room. Mark looked up from his paperwork, immediately setting aside his work. "Of course, buddy. What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Remember how I told you I wanted to start a club at school? Something to help kids who feel left out?" Mark nodded, a smile forming on his face. "Yeah, I remember. Have you talked to Ms. Ramirez about it yet?" "Not yet," Ethan admitted. "But I was thinking, maybe we could make it bigger than just our school. Maybe we could start something that helps kids everywhere, not just here." Mark raised his eyebrows, impressed by his son's ambition. "That's a great idea, Ethan. What kind of things would you want the club to do?" Ethan shrugged, trying to put his thoughts into words. I want it to be a place where kids can talk about stuff that's hard, like if they feel like they don't belong or if they're being treated unfairly. We could help each other feel better, and maybe even make things better for everyone. Mark's heart swelled with pride. Ethan had been through so much, and yet here he was, thinking about how he could help others. I think that's an amazing idea, buddy. I can help you with logistics if you want to expand it beyond your school. Maybe we could reach out to other schools in the district or even start a website where kids can share their stories. Ethan's eyes lit up at the suggestion. Really? You'd help me with that? Absolutely, Mark said, ruffling his son's hair. We can work on it together. This is your idea, and I think it could really make a difference. Feeling more energized than he had in weeks, Ethan began brainstorming ideas for the club that night. He thought about what he had gone through with Mrs. Harris and how lonely it had felt to carry that weight by himself. He didn't want any other kid to feel that way, and if he could create a space where kids could talk about their experiences and support one another, maybe things would start to change. By Monday morning, Ethan was ready to pitch his idea to Ms. Ramirez. When he arrived at school, he approached her desk nervously before class started. Ms. Ramirez? Ethan asked, his voice tentative. She looked up from her lesson plan, giving him her full attention. Yes, Ethan? I was wondering, do you think we could start a club at school? He asked, shifting from foot to foot. A club for kids who feel left out or need help with stuff, like if they're having a hard time with school or with people being mean to them. Ms. Ramirez's face brightened. I think that's a fantastic idea, Ethan. A club like that could really help a lot of students. Have you thought about what you'd want to call it? Ethan smiled, feeling his confidence growing. I was thinking of calling it the Bridge Club, like a bridge that helps people come together. Ms. Ramirez nodded approvingly. I love that. Let's talk to the principal about it after class and we can get the ball rolling. I'll help you organize it and we can get the word out to the other students. Ethan's heart raced with excitement. Things were finally starting to feel right again. He had spent so long feeling small and powerless, but now he was taking control. He was making a difference, not just for himself, but for other kids who might be feeling the same way. Later that day, Ms. Ramirez and Ethan met with Principal O'Connell to discuss the idea. To Ethan's surprise, the principal was fully supportive. I think this could be something special, Principal O'Connell said, leaning back in his chair. A club like this could really have a positive impact on the school. Let's set up a meeting for interested students next week, and we'll get it started. As Ethan left the office, his mind buzzed with ideas. He couldn't wait to get started. It felt like a new chapter of his life was beginning, one where he was no longer just a victim of Mrs. Harris's cruelty, but a leader who was helping create a better, more inclusive school environment. The Bridge Club at Maple Ridge Elementary officially launched a few weeks later. At the first meeting, Ethan was nervous. He wasn't sure how many kids would show up, or if anyone would take it seriously, but as the school day came to an end, more and more students filtered into the classroom where the meeting was being held. Connor was there, along with several other kids from Ethan's class, and even some students he didn't know well. In total, about 20 kids showed up, filling the room with chatter and curiosity. Ms. Ramirez stood at the front of the room, smiling as she watched Ethan prepare to address the group. She had told him earlier that day that he would be the one to lead the meeting. And though the thought of speaking in front of so many people made Ethan's heart race, he was determined to make it work. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stood up and faced the group. His voice wavered at first, but as he began to speak, his confidence grew. Hi, everyone, Ethan began, his hands trembling slightly. Thanks for coming today. I know this club is new, but I hope it can be a place where we all feel like we belong. School can be hard sometimes, and I know what it's like to feel left out or like you don't matter, but I want this club to be a place where we can talk about that stuff and help each other." The room was quiet as Ethan spoke, and for a moment, he worried that no one would understand what he was trying to do, but then Connor raised his hand. "Yeah, school can be tough," Connor said, glancing around the room. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not smart enough, especially in math, but it helps to know that other people feel the same way." Several other students nodded in agreement, and soon more kids began to speak up, sharing their own struggles with feeling left out, being bullied, or having trouble with schoolwork. The room buzzed with conversation, and Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment washing over him. This was exactly what he had wanted, a space where kids could be open and honest with each other, without fear of judgment. Ms. Ramirez stepped in to guide the conversation when needed, but for the most part the students led the discussion themselves. They talked about ways to support each other, how to be kinder to their classmates, and how to stand up for themselves when things got tough. As the meeting came to a close, Ethan stood in front of the group again, his heart full of pride. "Thanks for sharing, everyone. I think this club can be something really special." When the students began to leave, Connor patted Ethan on the back. "You did great, man. This club is awesome." "Thanks," Ethan said, grinning. "I wasn't sure how it would go, but I'm glad people showed up." As the weeks passed, the Bridge Club continued to grow. More students joined, and word spread around the school about the positive impact the club was having. Kids who had once felt isolated now had a place to connect, and even students who weren't part of the club started talking about how they could be more inclusive and supportive of each other. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in the kitchen doing his homework, his mom walked in with a newspaper in her hand. She had a proud smile on her face as she handed the paper to Ethan. "Look at this," Lisa said, her eyes twinkling with pride. Ethan unfolded the paper and saw a headline that made his heart skip a beat. "Student-led club promotes kindness and inclusion at Maple Ridge Elementary." Beneath the headline was a picture of Ethan and his friends at one of the Bridge Club meetings, along with a story about how the club was making a difference at the school. "Whoa," Ethan breathed, his eyes wide. "I didn't know they were writing about us." "Your principal sent them the story," Lisa explained, her voice full of pride. "People are really starting to notice what you're doing, Ethan. You're making a big difference." Ethan beamed, feeling a swell of pride in his chest. He had never imagined that his small idea for a club would grow into something that would impact the entire school. And yet, here he was, leading a movement that was helping kids feel accepted and valued. The ripple effect didn't stop there. Other schools in the district began reaching out to Ms. Ramirez and Principal O'Connell, asking how they could start similar clubs at their own schools. Soon, the Bridge Club model was being adopted by other elementary and middle schools, spreading the message of kindness and inclusivity far beyond Maple Ridge. Ethan couldn't believe how far his idea had come. What had started as a small effort to help kids at his school had grown into something much bigger, something that was making a real difference in the lives of students all over the district. One evening, as Ethan sat in his room reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year, he realized how much he had grown. He thought back to the boy he had been to before Mrs. Harris, the boy who had been excited about school, who had loved math, and who had believed in himself. That boy had been broken down by Mrs. Harris's cruelty, but he hadn't disappeared completely. He had fought his way back with the help of his parents, his friends, and his new teacher. And now he was stronger than ever. Ethan smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of peace. He wasn't just the boy who had been hurt. He was the boy who had risen above it, who had turned his pain into purpose. And that, he realized, was something no one could ever take away from him. As he drifted off to sleep that night, his mind filled with dreams of a brighter future, one where every student felt like they belonged, where kindness and understanding were the norm, and where no one had to face their struggles alone. Ethan Walker, once hurt by the cruel words of his teacher, has overcome it all to find his confidence again. With the love and support of his family, he not only stood up to injustice but turned his pain into strength, helping other students through the bridge club he founded. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that we can transform our biggest challenges into opportunities for growth and positive change. No longer lost, Ethan became a leader, spreading the message of kindness and fairness. His journey shows us that even in the face of pain, we can rise and make a difference for ourselves and others. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. What would you do if you were in Ethan's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.